Hello and join me in welcoming a very favorite guest for Roundtable, Veer Sanghvi, who today, you've often seen him on my shows discussing the story of the day or the story of the week. But today, Veer Sanghvi is the story himself. He's come out with a book on his life called A Rude Life, a memoir. And in fact, my first question to you, Veer, is actually going to be what made you write something right now? Because there's still, as I said in my review, also a long way to go as yet. So, to pen down a memoir now, was it just a lockdown labor or something else?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all the credit for writing this book goes to the coronavirus. If I hadn't been locked down at home with nothing else to do, I don't think that I've written it. Various people have suggested to me keep a diary, write a memoir, and I've always been the sort of chap who doesn't look back. So writing a memoir seemed out of character for me. And then when you write a memoir, ultimately it's an act of supreme arrogance, because you're assuming that people are interested enough in your pathetic little life to want to read about it. So I could never quite bring myself to do it, but I was driven to desperation by the lockdown, and so I finally did it.
Because having worked with you, having known you, I didn't see you as being a Pranab Mukherjee sort of person who kept a diary every night. And in fact, I don't even remember you taking notes in your interviews. You used to just come back. And so, was it this
No,
all from memory?
I'm a it's all in my head kind of guy. And the older I get, and I suppose the more my head will degenerate and rot, I thought I should write it all down before I forget.
And as about your, what did you say, pathetic life, I think Sharishi Tharoor has something slightly more complimentary. He's called it the widely entertaining world of Veer Sanghvi. And having read it, I think Tharoor is right on
No,
that
I
one.
read it. I was also very excited. Now I'm looking for wild entertainment, but I haven't found any.
Okay, so those who are looking for wild entertainment, I suggest you look at the bits of his interactions with various Bollywood actors, stars, from Amitabh Bachchan to the now to the Shah Rukh Khan and etc. But as a political journalist, I think what interested me was your political, coverage. You've met prime ministers, I think, from Rajiv Gandhi onwards. You've covered from the 70s. I think you've been writing, covering politics. Before I go on to the political part, just one, I think since we should have something for everything, can you tell us about your interaction with Shah Rukh Khan? I found that pretty funny also.
Well, I didn't know Shah Rukh Khan, and he was supposed to be difficult to get to. So we were shooting the show I did called Star Talk, and we were shooting it in Bombay. And the way we used to shoot it was we would hire a studio and we would call guests. We'd call more than one guest because budgets were limited. So you made the most of the studio. So you shot maybe 3 programs a day, 4 programs a day. So we were shooting with Amitabh Bachchan, and he said to me quite reasonably that he didn't have much time. He was shooting for Karan Johar's Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum. And he said, look, you're going to have to hire a set anyway, right? A studio. So I said, yeah. So he said, you hire the studio next to mine where I'm shooting. And they were shooting, remember that Shava Shava song where they did that pulling the toilet flush gesture? So they were shooting that. And if you ever attended a song shooting, you will know it's the most boring thing in the world, and there are long gaps. And he said, I'm certain to have a gap and I'll do your interview. So we arranged for this. We hired the studio. We erected the set. And to make it worthwhile, so it wasn't just one interview, we invited Ravina Tandon in the morning. She came and we got a very good interview with her. And I think, yes, we also did Priyanka Chopra, who was then a young actress just starting out, making her first film. Nobody had actually interviewed her as a star before. She'd been interviewed as a beauty queen. And we got her to come in, and she was very poised, very confident. No film had been released. And I remember saying, and I pat myself on the back for this, I remember saying to her at the end of the interview, you are going to be a very big star. And it's something I wondered about, and I was absolutely right. She was going to be a big star, and she is a big star. Meanwhile, to get back to Shah Rukh Khan,
Yes, that's the
Joyita,
part I like.
well, the Priyanka's part I like, but Joyita, who was one of the ladies who worked on the set and who set up the shows, we all came and watched the Shava Shava song. She saw Shah Rukh Khan, and because she's a sort of forthright sort of person, went up to him and said, we're doing these interviews for Veer Sanghvi show. Would you like to come? And to her absolute surprise and horror, he said, yeah, sure. I have a break at such and such time. I'll come. And that was before Amitabh Bachchan was coming on. So I was a little skeptical, and we waited to see if he would turn up. And we were still discussing that it's now time, let's see, should we go and call him? When we looked, we had the table in those days where we shot Star Talk, and there sitting in the stage chair was Shah Rukh Khan, smoking a cigarette. He'd come in without anyone noticing, had quietly gone and sat down. So I went over and I introduced myself, and we did this interview. And he was really charming, really forthcoming, really bright. And so I thought I would ask him the question that everybody in the industry had been whispering about, but nobody had the guts to ask him that. And I said, he talked about affairs and all that. And I said, you haven't been linked with very many women. And he said, no. And I said, but there is, of course, a rumor that you're gay. So are you really? And he said, no, I'm not gay. I'm not bisexual. There's a rumor also that I sleep with married women, which is why you don't hear about it. But that's also not true. And he was really cool and charming about it. But it was, in a sense, the moment, because nobody had asked him this question before. And I asked it in a perfectly normal way. He answered in a perfectly normal way. And I didn't think that much of it. But the film press, of course, went crazy when the interview was telecast. And I remember film journalists asked him, he said, why did Veer Sanghvi ask you if you were a homosexual? And he said, I thought very, very charmingly, he said, I have no idea. Maybe if I had said yes, he'd have invited me for dinner.
In fact, to keep up with the wildly entertaining theme of the book, what I found very interesting was also the encounters between Rajiv and Zail Singh. Maybe not in the same Shah Rukh Khan vein, but you had a ringside view and you managed to speak to both the personalities involved. So tell us a bit about that, the face-off and...
Talking to Zail Singh was actually not so difficult. This was a period when relations between the Prime Minister and the President were at an all-time low. Zail Singh had this really bright and competent PR guy called Tirlochan Singh, who was the deputy press secretary.
Yes.
And he would find journalists and he would take us to meet Zail Singh, and Zail Singh would relate his tale of woe. In most cases, in the case of most Delhi journalists who heard it, they'd been around, that met presidents, etc. I was a Bombay journalist. I used to edit a magazine called Imprint. I came to Delhi and I met Tirlochan, thinking he would brief me about what was happening. And he said, come and meet Kyani ji. So I jaw dropped. I was not a sort of person who was used to meeting presidents or prime ministers or anything. So I said, okay. So he led me through Rashtrapati Bhavan, through these very grand halls, to the president's quarters, which actually are comparatively modest compared to the grandeur of what used to be the viceroy's house. And there on a bed, his turban off with a little chuda on his head, was the president. I think he was wearing a banyan, was the president of India, and he'd taken to his bed. And he seemed at that stage, hard as this is to believe, because you usually saw Zail Singh wearing a sherwani with a rose and all that. He seemed really vulnerable. And he told me how badly he'd been treated by Rajiv and how he'd made Rajiv prime minister, and how if he'd come out against the government during the Delhi riots, he would have been the next Maharaja Ranjit Singh, all that stuff. And we ran the story. It had some impact, of course. But later, I think about a year later, when I became editor of Sunday magazine, I had the opportunity to meet Rajiv Gandhi, in the sense that he was on a plane going to Mizoram and they smuggled me into his cabin and he chatted to me. It was an off the record chat. And it turned out he'd read the article in Imprint magazine, which was not very widely read in Delhi, which surprised me. And he was very eager to talk about Zail Singh, and he'd never spoken before. And he gave me his version of what had happened, what an embarrassment Zail Singh was, how Zail Singh just wanted a second term, how he wanted to play Punjab politics from Rashtrapati Bhavan. It was pretty fantastic stuff, because he'd never said this before. But I had that old ethical thing. So I got back to Delhi. When we landed that night, I called Tirlochan, and I went and saw him. And I think K.C. Singh, who was really the most brilliant man in Rashtrapati Bhavan in those days. And they did a rebuttal to everything Rajiv had said. So we ran the story, giving the president's point of view and giving the prime minister's point of view. And it was probably the first time anybody had probably been able to get both in the same story. And it was a good feeling.
Wow. Look at, and one thing in fact, you didn't highlight is when Zail Singh told you that Indira Gandhi, I think, had told him that in case...
I thought you were going to get to that. Okay, yeah. I thought I skimmed over that.
That would save Pranab Mukherjee a lot of grief if he'd known that about you.
Yeah, but people forget that Pranab Mukherjee was very out with Rajiv and Arun Nehru during these days. Pranab Mukherjee's sole support base was Indira Gandhi. So when Indira Gandhi died, his support base sadly went with her. But according to what Zail Singh told me, this is one of the reasons he thought Rajiv should have been grateful to him, was that Mrs. Gandhi, even when she was saying that, I don't know what will happen, the Congress will elect a leader, etc., he said, she used to say that to the public, but to me, she used to tell the truth. And she told me that if anything happens to me, and Mrs. Gandhi then was living with the fear of assassination, and it did happen, so she was right. Swear Rajiv in before the Congress party has a chance to react. And he said, I am so loyal. I came back from abroad. Nobody gave me any respect. I was booed. I think some story said his car was like, but I kept my word to her and I swore Rajiv in immediately.
Well, that is, in fact, that is something I was, thinking that would really make a lot of headlines in terms of, what all happened in terms of the maneuvering and Pranab Mukherjee, Arun Nehru, that whole face-off. But moving on, you
also told me his tale of woe. I mean, there's a story.
Pranab Mukherjee also.
Yeah, I haven't put it in the book. There's a story about how I found myself sitting next to Pranab Mukherjee on a flight from Calcutta to Delhi. And I've got the last part of the story, which is I was carrying the budget papers for Business Standard, and I was trying to take them down the stairs. It was difficult. They were huge, big business papers. And Pranab said to me, he said, can I take some? I've carried budget papers before. So I've put that in the book. I haven't put the story because he then told me the whole sad story of how he was on this special plane with Rajiv Gandhi and how they were all very tense because they'd heard Mrs. Gandhi was dying. And halfway through, Rajiv went into the cockpit, came out, and then announced to them she is no more. And he was, of course, very dignified according to Pranab and tried hard to maintain a facade. Pranab is emotional Bengali. He says, I loudly burst into tears. I could not control myself at all. But I mean, he was able to function while weeping, clearly, because he then went to the cockpit and sent a message that the cabinet secretary and the 3 chiefs of staff should come to the airport to receive the aircraft. He said this was an established convention, that there must be a sense that somebody is in charge of the government. He was number 2 in Mrs. Gandhi's government. So he thought that temporarily he would restore some order. He said Arun Nehru and possibly Rajiv got the impression that he had already taken charge and he was acting like he was prime minister and were completely livid. And when Rajiv then eventually formed his cabinet, Pranab was out.
That's the story that I think everybody's talking about. But, while reading the book, when you read the Rajiv chapters, there's I noticed a very indulgent tone. There was, I think you had a good rapport with him or, in terms of the lot of interviews you did with him also. But I'm trying to figure out which is the prime minister you had the most contempt for.
Can you figure out which is the prime minister I liked the most?
I think it's Rajiv.
No.
Am I wrong?
Chandrasekhar was my pal. Chandrasekhar is the one I got along with.
No way. The one who had what did he have? A farmhouse instead of an ashram?
He had a country club, yeah.
Country club, according to Rajiv Gandhi.
I'd always liked Chandrasekhar. There's a wonderful straight quality to him. There was no bullshit. He was unpretentious. He would sit on the floor at his house in South Avenue Lane. You could talk to him. You could joke with him. There was something about that man. I think, in a sense, he never got his due.
Wow. So Chandrasekhar first, but which is the one that you like the least? Am I right in thinking
VP
that
VP
Singh?
Yeah, because the damage he did in India.
I'm going to come back. We're going to take a break. But, I thought it was VP Singh also when I first read the book. But reading it again before the interview, I think I find that you've been very harsh on Manmohan Singh. In fact, there is a lot of do I say contempt or impatience with Manmohan Singh? I don't know what is the right word. VP Singh, Narasimha Rao, and then Manmohan Singh. Is that the list?
VP Singh, I thought was venal. I thought that what he did with Mandal and the way in which he behaved only to secure his position, and he tried to transform India, never having previously said he would do it. I thought that was pretty terrible. Narasimha Rao is an old rogue. And he achieved many good things. He did the liberalization thing, which all of us benefited from. And he never quite gets the credit for reorienting India's foreign policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, I mean, he did good things. Ultimately, he was like a rogue who hung around with people like Chandraswamy and did many dodgy things. But no.
So did Chandrasekhar.
Chandrasekhar never actually gave Chandraswamy that much influence. He was
Hmm.
happy to hang around with, but Chandraswamy certainly did not come to number 5 and conduct havans on behalf of Chandrasekhar as he did for Narasimha Rao. And Manmohan Singh, as finance minister, I think was outstanding, the best finance minister we've ever had. As prime minister in UPA 1, he was, I think, one of the best prime ministers we've had. My problem with Manmohan Singh was UPA 2, but we'll talk about that in the next segment.
Take a break. Thank you for giving me the prompt for that. One more question about Narasimha Rao. You said that he was not a reformer, but more of a pragmatist, I think you said. So he saw that was the only way to stay in power. That's the only thing that had to be done. So he did it. But he was not pro-reforms. He quotes Gorbachev also to you, saying, talking about the danger of being a reformer.
Yeah. I think Narasimha Rao, I mean, he's been in politics for a very long time. There was not a single reformist bone in his body, but he was put into a position of power at a time when India was bankrupt, when the IMF was imposing various conditions to bail us out. Any prime minister would have had to accept those conditions. To Narasimha Rao's credit, he looked outside the political system. He tried first to make I.G. Patel finance minister. When I.G. Patel turned the job down, he made Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh had no experience of ministership, was easily upset, would threaten to resign, would weep, etc. Narasimha Rao backed him. He cleared the political path for him. And I think nobody can take that credit away from Narasimha Rao. So the fact that he was not a reformer did not stop him from doing what needed to be done.
And yet, you wrote cover stories in Sunday saying, "Will this man please wake up?" You called his PMO a bunch. PV Prasad was called Joker in every article, and so on and so forth. And yet, Narasimha Rao met you.
He met me even though I said all of that. The reason I said, "Will this man please wake up?" was there was a time in Mumbai, my city was burning. You needed to call the army and you needed to do something. There was a fragile communal peace in Mumbai, which was destroyed. It had been India's most cosmopolitan city, and suddenly people were being killed on the streets. And Narasimha Rao had no interest in doing anything about it. If we hadn't done covers like "Will this man please wake up?" etc., I don't think he would have been pushed into doing anything. So I believe that by saying that, we weren't really attacking Narasimha Rao. We were doing, if not national service, at least service to the city of Mumbai. As for calling PV Prasad Joker, I mean, that's not my name. That's what everyone in the PMO called it.
Really?
Not in a Heath Ledger, Jack Nicholson way, I hasten to add.
Okay, now to Manmohan Singh. In fact, I've got that sentence underlined here, which says, "I take notes, Veer, even if you don't."
All right.
Manmohan Singh, rather than owning up to the shameful inaction in office, was content to be portrayed as a victim of the Gandhis.
Yeah.
You really think so?
Correct? What is the narrative? You ask anybody on Manmohan Singh, and they will say, "Hey, puppet prime minister, bichara, kya karega?" Sonia and Rahul called the shots. He had no choice. He had to just keep quiet and go along with it. Hasn't that become the narrative? That's a narrative spread by people who were close to Manmohan Singh. That's a narrative Manmohan Singh has done nothing to denounce or deny. He's quite content to take that role.
That role does have, I mean, the Gandhis also carried that role forward. No, we've talked about Rahul Gandhi tearing the ordnance, that's well known. But even otherwise, Manmohan Singh was there for, I mean, Sonia Gandhi and the National Advisory Council, or the fact that there were all these ministers who were there. It was all the corrupt allies who were there. I mean, at the end of the day, it was also something, the compulsion of the party that he took the brunt for.
Actually, that's not true. This is a man who has stood for election only once in his life for the Lok Sabha and who has lost. He is a man with no political allies, with no support structure within the Congress party. He is elevated to the highest political office in the land by Sonia Gandhi because she believes he's honest, that he has stature, and that he's competent, all of which is true. For that first term, a balance is struck between them. Sonia Gandhi looks after the party, she looks after politics. Manmohan Singh looks after government. There's a second balance that is struck, which is Manmohan Singh understands the economy, probably better than anybody else. But Sonia Gandhi believes that in all these years of liberalization, the benefits of liberalization have not reached the poor. She believes that one reason Vajpayee and Advani lost was because when they were talking about India shining and patting each other on the back. They forgot the poor. They forgot the people at the margins of our society. Her idea, therefore, was to do direct transfers, to create schemes that would give people something without waiting for a trickle-down effect. That accounts for Narega and all of the other welfare schemes she did. They worked so well that Mr. Modi has incorporated nearly all of them. He's named them after himself and other BJP figures, but they're basically the same old schemes. Manmohan Singh looked after the formal economy. That balance worked very well. Yes, occasionally the National Advisory Council, which is basically Jholawalas, may have done something that irritated him. But Sonia's job was to keep the balance, and she did a very good job doing that. It was in the second term, when she was removed from the scene by ill health, was away for long periods, that the balance broke down and the problems began.
Another thing that we want to ask you is, do you think that for at some level RTI is the reason for downfall of UPA too? Because you said that at the whiff of a scandal, Sonia Gandhi used to dismiss a minister, which also gave the impression that UPA was full of scam-tainted, corrupt ministers. Which is today you see we have various scams coming up, but they don't even acknowledge it. So it's Vyapam scam for one that comes to mind, etc. So they just brush. Nobody talks about it. So it's not a scam-ridden government. So then was RTI a huge mistake then, do you think?
It wasn't RTI. I mean, if you're going to look at an institution that caused problems for the UPA, the CAG was the biggest one. We've never had a CAG before who invented figures and called it a loss that might have happened, might not have happened, which is what happened in the case of the 2G scam. He calculated the loss, working out if there had been an auction, they would have raised so much money. Which, I mean, those figures have been disputed because there was an auction, they raised nothing like that money. These documents were leaked from the CAG's office. They held press conferences. They actually worked to glorify themselves and to damage the government using fanciful figures. Nobody had ever done that before. I mean, to the eternal shame of the UPA, they had appointed the CAG. And ultimately, that was in many ways their undoing. There was a second factor, and that I think was Sonia Gandhi's own self-righteousness. At the slightest whiff of some allegation of immorality or whatever, she would say, no, we don't want him in the cabinet. We want to seem cleaner than clean. Look at Natwar Singh, who was very close to her. Yeah. There was an allegation that his son had made some money on some deal in somewhere in the Middle East. I think it may have been Iraq. And
Iraq.
Yeah, it was Iraq. And though Natwar Singh had many defenses and eventually nothing was found against his son, she had him thrown out from the government. Look at Shashi Tharoor. I mean, you laugh at what he was accused of. The suggestion was that his then girlfriend had helped somebody get an IPL franchise. When is that? Is that such a huge crime? He was sacked. Nothing came of that. Those charges were never proved. So you only had to make a noise. You had to make an allegation. And Sonia would insist that the person was sacked. In her mind, she thought the country would hail her for being cleaner than clean, tolerating any kind of corruption. She was wrong. The country believed the allegations, and because people don't normally sack people unless there's some smoke there, some fire there, people believe that the UPA was a scam-ridden government. I think that was the problem.
You mentioned Natwar Singh, which reminds me, you've written in your book about how Sonia Gandhi always wanted to make Manmohan Singh the prime minister, which is at variance with the story that Natwar Singh tells in his book, where he says she wanted to be PM, the kids cried.
She really wanted the job, and the kids said, no, mommy, you can't do it. And
something like that.
Manmohan Singh. Yeah, I know his version. And he knew her very well. He has every right to his version, but I have my version depending on my conversations with her.
Fair enough. Another part is, we've talked about it. I've heard you talk about the other interviews also. You mentioned the Radia tapes, considering that it's come out at a time when we are seeing the Pegasus tapes. Now, the fact that at that time they created a huge storm. Later on, you had the tapes verified, and you found that they were, they were all fake, or they were, manipulated. Yeah. So that's not really the part I want to talk to you, but I want to talk to that point. It created a huge scandal, but today the Pegasus tapes are not taking off. Why is that? What is the difference?
Because
it's again a snooping spying scandal.
In the case of the Radia tape, you had tapes, you had transcripts of conversations, you had audio clips, so there was something real. Now you have an allegation that so-and-so was an object of interest that communicates less well. Also, there's a sense, and Pegasus, the government was going after people it always goes after, journalists, other politicians, etc. In the case of the Radia tapes, it played into a fear that I think the average voter has. The average voter always believes that he's not being told the truth, that India is run by some secret cabal at the top where they all meet and they all fix things. And because the Radia tapes are presented in a way that made this seem like reality, they confirmed, I mean, conspiracy theories are always good for publicity. They confirm that sense that these people at the top are all manipulating things and we at the bottom, or we at even the middle, have no idea what's happening. That's what gave that story its power. The current story, Pegasus, doesn't have that power.
You also have a theory as to who leaked those tapes, because they were leaked in a very collaborated manner, and someone who wants to see Mukesh Ambani and Ratan Tata down, but you said you're not going to tell us who it is.
This is correct. I'm not.
I thought maybe you might help us.
I think it's unlikely. Priya, after many people going through the book and my refusing to write in the book, that I would suddenly blurt it out to you.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to now judge the book by its cover, really. And before going, I'm going to ask you, why call it A Rude Life? I went and looked up the meaning of rude, and it's everything from basic to rudimentary to rude to hearty to abrupt. So what kind of a life have you led?
Yeah, it's not my title, A Rude Life. It's a title that the publisher thought of. And in my own household, there was at least one member who didn't want the book called A Rude Life, and she objected very, very strongly. But I think it was probably at the end of the day a marketing decision, partly because of rude food, partly because of the irreverent nature also they thought of what I had written. So they went with Rude Life.
Fair enough. It's a good title, as I said, and it's working clearly. But thank you for talking to us.
Putting up the word rude in the dictionary, so it's achieved something, right?
On that note, I'll let you have the last word. Thank you, Veer Sanghvi, for talking to us.
Thank you. What a pleasure this was. Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.